Hello everyone! I'm very excited to be continuing my Bridgerton inspired series by sharing how I made this drawstring dress. Now this video is sort of a redo of my last drawstring dress and video. However, this time I have put the pattern in my Etsy, so hopefully you can download the PDF and make a dress like this for yourself. And while this dress isn't 100% historically accurate, it is inspired by historical gowns and some of the dresses worn on Bridgerton. I also love that this dress is very flexible with its fit and can fit a window of sizes due to the drawstring in the neck and waist. So I'm very excited to share, and let's get started. Now for materials for this dress, I will be using 5 meters of this satin viscose I found at my local shop, as well as a complementing thread. I will also be using this fabric to create ties that match, but you of course could opt for ribbon instead. Next, I print out my pattern. You can find this pattern in my Etsy shop as a downloadable PDF, and I print out all 60 pages on paper size A4 and scale 100%. After printing, I check the measurements of the square on the first page in the top left-hand corner, and if everything looks good, I go ahead and assemble my pattern, just trimming the margins as needed and taping it together to create a grid that is 60 pages. After assembling the pattern, this is what it should look like. And the next thing you can do is cut it to your desired size. I will be making my dress in size medium, so I cut all of the pattern pieces out in size medium. Next, I cut all of the pieces out of my fabric. And I start by cutting the front portion of my skirt on the fold, and the next thing I cut is the back portion of my skirt on the fold as well. And I did decide that I wanted there to be a train on the back of my dress, so I did cut the back portion of my skirt with the train extension. And I also initially thought that I wanted to make the longer elbow length sleeves, but I later trimmed those and decided to make the shorter puff sleeves. As you can see, I'm sort of smoothing out my fabric before cutting because this satin viscose is very slippy and a little bit fussy. And when cutting, I'm not able to get perfectly up to the edge of my pattern, so there is an additional ½ centimeter of allowance on my pieces, which makes for a total of 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance. I also cut the front and back portion of my bodice on the fold. Since there really isn't an opening to the dress, we cinch it shut with the drawstring. The last thing I do is use my guide to cut 6 full widths of fabric. One will be used for the neckline casing, 1 for the waist casing, 2 for the neckline drawstring, and 2 for the waist drawstring. And that will make my drawstrings extra long. You of course could get away with just using 1 full width for the neckline drawstring and 1 full width for the waist drawstring if you wanted shorter ties. And now I have all of my pieces cut out. I have 6 full widths of fabric for the casings and drawstrings. I have 2 sleeve bands, 2 sleeves, 1 bodice back cut on the fold, 1 bodice front cut on the fold, 1 skirt back cut on the fold, and 1 skirt front cut on the fold. And like I mentioned, I last minute decided that I instead wanted short puff sleeves, so I went ahead and trimmed my sleeve. Next, I'm going to match my sleeve to my sleeve band. So I start by adding a line of gathering stitches to the bottom edge of my sleeve. I just set my machine to the straight stitch on the longest length and sew across the bottom edge. And then I pull the ends of the threads to gather up that bottom edge of my sleeve so that the bottom edge matches the length of my sleeve band. Next, I pin my sleeve band to the bottom edge of my sleeve. I match the right side of my sleeve band facing the wrong side of my sleeve. And then I just pin those edges together, sort of easing in the gathering to match the length of my sleeve band. Next, I sew along that bottom edge, attaching the sleeve band to my sleeve. And after straight stitching, I go back and finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. Now we're going to finish the bottom of our sleeve by creating the cuff. I'm going to fold the sleeve band over so that it's visible when looking at the right side of the sleeve, and then use an iron to press the seam allowance down. Next, I'm going to fold the sleeve band 2 times. I'm going to fold it once to cover its raw edge, and a second time just to cover the seam allowance a little bit and pin it down in place. And I'm just going to carefully work along that bottom edge, folding the sleeve band 2 times, overlapping the seam allowance where the sleeve joins the sleeve band, and pin that sleeve band in place. And here is how it should look once you have your sleeve band pinned in place. And now you can just top stitch very carefully along that folded edge. This will secure the sleeve band to the sleeve and cover the raw edge. And here is how the sleeve should look with the sleeve band attached to the bottom edge. The next thing I'm going to do is add a row of gathering stitches along the head of the sleeve. This is so that later I can ease the sleeve into the arm side of my bodice. Next, I'm going to join the front of my bodice to the back of my bodice at the shoulders. And I'm going to match them together, wrong sides touching, and finish this edge with a French seam. To do that, I'm just going to straight stitch along the shoulder edges that have been pinned together. And after stitching, I'm going to trim the seam allowance and then fold it over on that created seam and stitch one more time. Next, I like to top stitch the seam allowance of that French seam down. I think it just makes it a little easier when adding the drawstring. Next, I'm going to create the neckline casing for the bodice. I start at the center back, since that is where I want my ties to be. I pin one of my cut widths of fabric to the neckline, the right side of my casing facing the wrong side of my bodice. And at the center back, I trim the excess fabric and then fold the edges inward to hide the raw edges. And then I stitch the casing all around the neckline of my bodice. And I just make sure that at the center back, the two casing edges perfectly abut one another and that the edges are folded inwards so that no raw edges are visible. I also like to finish this raw edge with a zigzag stitch. And here's what it looks like when one width of your fabric has been sewn to the neckline of your bodice. We're going to finish it up by turning it into a casing for a drawstring. To do this, I flip my bodice over so that I can see the right side, and then I fold that width of fabric over 2 times. I'm going to fold it once to hide its own raw edge, and then fold it a second time so that it slightly overlaps the seam allowance, and then I'm going to pin it in place. And we're going to work around the entire neckline of our bodice, folding that width of fabric over 2 times and pinning it in place. And this is what's going to create the casing so that we can later insert a drawstring and cinch the neckline tight. And my biggest tip is just to work very slowly and carefully as you fold that band of fabric around the neckline of your bodice. You want to be very careful not to pull or twist the casing, since that can cause warping or rippling. And here's what it should look like once you have that band of fabric pinned in place as the casing for the neckline of your bodice. We can now top stitch very closely to that folded edge, which will secure the casing in place. Next, we're going to sew the front of our bodice to the back of our bodice at the side edges. We're going to start by matching the wrong sides together, very gently easing and matching those curved edges to one another and pinning them in place. And here's what it looks like with the front of my bodice matched to the back of my bodice at the side edges. Now I'm going to very carefully stitch these edges together, again with wrong sides touching. And then I'm going to trim the seam allowance, fold it over on that created seam, and stitch it one more time to create a French seam. And this is how the bodice should look right now. Next, we are going to insert the sleeves into the arm side of our bodice. Start by matching the sides of the sleeve together and finish this edge with a French seam. I like to match the wrong sides together and pin in place, stitch the sides together, trim the seam allowance, fold it on that seam and stitch one more time to encase the raw edges within itself. Next, match the side seam on the sleeve to the side seam on your bodice and pin the sleeve into the armhole. The narrow part of the sleeve will fit along the armpit of the bodice, with the wider portion of the sleeve gathered down at the top and matched to the shoulder of your bodice. As I pin my sleeve into the armhole of my bodice, I like to keep it flat and smooth along the back and underarm of my bodice. And I concentrate the bulk of the gathers at the top of my shoulder for the puffed sleeve. And I am sorry it's a little difficult to see what I'm doing in this footage. But if you look directly into the armhole, you can see my bodice and sleeve are pinned flat against one another, with the gathers all focused within 11 centimeters at the top of the shoulder. Next, I stitch my sleeve into the armhole of my bodice, going all the way around. After stitching, I trim the seam allowance and then finish the raw edge with a tight zigzag stitch. Now that our bodice has sleeves, we can sew up the skirt and attach it to our bodice. I start by putting a safety pin in the center back and center front of my skirt pieces. This is so that it's easier to find the center front and center back later. Next, I match and pin the side of the front of my skirt to the side of the back of my skirt, wrong sides touching. And after I pin the sides together, I finish this edge with a French seam, and then repeat for the other side, matching the side of the front of my skirt to the side of the back of my skirt, stitching this seam, trimming the seam allowance, folding it over on the newly created seam, and stitching it one more time to enclose the raw edge within itself. And that way, both sides of my skirt are finished with a French seam, and there are no visible raw edges, and it will give the skirt a nice neat finish. And once the sides of my skirt have been sewn together, I can now attach the waist edge of my skirt to the waist edge of my bodice. Here you can see I've marked the center front and center back of my skirt with safety pins, and you can also see the side seams of my skirt finished with a French seam. Next, I match the center front of my bodice to the center front of my skirt and pin the edges together with wrong sides touching. I then pin the skirt to the bodice, smooth against one another along their waist edges. As I work, I pin these edges together smoothly until I reach the back of the bodice. At the back of the bodice, I will pleat down the remaining skirt edge fabric to fit the bodice back. I will use about 5 pleats on either side, each pleat about 5 centimeters deep. When pleating down the remainder of the skirt fabric to fit to the bodice back, I like to start at the center back and then pleat my way outwards, making sure that the pleats are symmetrical, and if necessary, they overlap a little bit to accommodate a lot of that extra fabric and to keep the bulk of it at the back of the bodice. Once everything is satisfactory, I can then stitch the skirt to my bodice all along that waist edge. But here you can see that the bodice and the skirt are smooth against one another, just the pleats at the very back of the bodice. Once I am satisfied that my skirt has been pinned to my bodice appropriately and that all of my pleats are symmetrical and look good, I can go ahead and stitch these two edges together, again with wrong sides touching. After stitching these edges together, I like to trim the seam allowance and then finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. The next thing I'm going to do is press the seam allowance up towards the bodice and then top stitch it down. The reason for all this is because I'm going to be adding the casing over top this seam. And by creating the seam on the right side of our dress, we can cover it up with the casing so that it is not visible from the outside or inside of the dress, thus covering all of the raw edges. After top stitching the seam allowance towards the bodice, this is what your dress should look like from the outside and the inside. We can now set aside the dress for a moment as we turn our remaining 5 widths of fabric into our casing and 2 ties. For the waist casing, fold 1 width of fabric in half and pin the long edges together. Next, you can stitch all along that long edge to create one long tube, which will be later turned into the waistline casing. Now I will be making 2 drawstring ties that are extra long. So to make my drawstring ties extra long, I will first be joining 2 widths of fabric at the side edges and stitching them together. After stitching the sides together, I can now fold my long strip of fabric in half, pin the long edges together, and then I'm going to stitch all along those side edges. This will be creating 2 very long tubes of fabric that will become my drawstring ties. Each tie is about 2 full widths of fabric long. Here you can see my 3 tubes of fabric, which I am going to turn right side out and then press flat. One is 1 width of fabric long for the waistline casing, one is 2 widths of fabric long for the neckline drawstring, and one is 2 widths of fabric long for the waistline drawstring. After turning them right side out, I press them flat with an iron, trying to keep the seam in the back. Next, I'm going to push the raw edges inside the tube and then top stitch them down to hide the raw edges. Now I'm going to cover my waist seam with 1 tube of fabric that will become the drawstring casing. I start at the center back of my dress and fold the edge inward on my tube of fabric and pin it down to the waist of my dress. I will be pinning this tube of fabric flat against the entire waistline of my dress, covering that waist seam. And as I'm pinning, I want to be sure that this tube of fabric is flat against my dress, covering up that seam. I also want to be careful that I'm not catching the other side of my dress as I'm pinning, making sure that that tube of fabric that will become the drawstring casing is only pinned to the appropriate portion of the dress. I work around the entire waistline of my dress, pinning the casing, and once I reach the other side at the center back of my dress, I realize that casing is a little bit long. So I trim the excess fabric and then fold the edge in just a little bit to cover the raw edge and pin it down in place. And here is what it will look like. It is now ready to be taken to the machine, where you can top stitch down that waistline casing to the waistline of your dress, making sure to cover that seam. In fact, you can use that seam as a guide to help position that casing on your dress. Here you can see my waist seam and how I've positioned the casing over top. The bottom edge of the casing is covering the seam just a little bit. And once you're happy with the casing placement, you can top stitch along both the top and bottom edges, securing the casing to the waistline of the dress. Now that we have made a drawstring casing for both the neckline and the waist of our dress, we can now go back and add the ties so that we can cinch the dress shut. I just put my tie on a bobby pin and work it through the casing on both the neckline and the waist. And I just start at the center back since that is where I have left an opening for the ties to enter and exit. Now I of course have made 2 extra long matching ties, but you of course could opt for ribbon ties instead. After both of my drawstrings have been added, I try on my dress and see if I need to trim the bottom edge before hemming my dress. After a quick try on, I decided I wanted to trim the center front of my dress by about 1 inch. This way it would be a little bit easier to walk in. After trimming the center front and giving it a double check for the length, I went ahead and gave the bottom edge a very simple and small rolled hem. And this is because my fabric was very slippy and fussy. I didn't want to try a big bulky hem. I really thought the simple rolled hem that I usually use would work great. And now that the bottom edge of my dress is finished, it is ready to be worn. And I just quickly want to show you how to wear this dress. Again, most of the fit and cinching is going to come from the drawstring along the neckline and the waist. You can sort of fidget and fuss with the gathers. I like to push most of the gathers to the center front of my dress, keeping the back mostly smooth. And as you can see, the pleated skirt that's fitted to the back portion of our bodice is where a lot of the volume is going to be, and it's going to help create a lovely draped shape to the back of our skirt. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this video and would like to see more fun DIY videos and more Bridgerton inspired content, definitely like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.